The lake does not look large on a map. A pale oval, perhaps 1.5 kilometers across at its widest point, tucked between low hills and the dense boreal forest of southern Ostrobothnia. But in the winters of the early 20th century, when the roads were little more than frozen cart paths and the nearest railway lay more than a day's journey away, Lake Brunn might as well have been a world unto itself. The ice came early that year, November's first frost locking the surface before the migrating birds had even gone. By Christmas, it was thick enough to take a horse-drawn sled, the way some villagers still used to cut across to save the long walk around. But those who lived closest to its shores seldom crossed it. There were too many stories. The people of Brunella, the scattered hamlet that bore the lake's name, spoke in the flat, unhurried manner of rural Finns, but if the conversation turned to the water, they would grow guarded, their eyes drifting away as if listening for something in the distance. The lake had a reputation. Not a single one written in official ledgers, not the kind you would find in the parish archives, but the kind carried in the pauses between sentences. Old Mikko Heikkinen, who had lived all 72 of his years within sight of the water, put it simply, the lake remembers who goes in. He said it one evening in the corner of the tavern, where the light barely reached, his hands wrapped around a cup of cloudberry liquor. I had asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and muttered, "Ask the families." You didn't have to look far to find them. There was the Korpela boy, who went missing in 1894 when the ice should have been strong enough to hold a wagon. His mother swore she heard him calling from the middle of the lake at dusk for weeks afterward. In 1902, a pair of brothers, Tapio and Armas Van Hala, drowned while fishing through the ice. Only their sled and tackle were found, the whole perfectly neat, as if cut from below. And there were the older tales, half-remembered and harder to confirm, of soldiers vanishing in the lake during the Russian occupation, their bodies never recovered. By 1910, most villagers simply avoided it once the freeze came. The few who ventured near in winter, to fetch water, to check traps along the shoreline, claimed that some nights, when the air was still and the moon hung low, they heard faint noises under the ice. Not the creaks and groans of frozen water shifting, but something rhythmic, deliberate, almost like a voice too far to make out the words. It was a harsh place even in the best of times. The surrounding forest, thick with spruce and birch, blocked much of the sunlight, so the lake often lay in shadow for most of the day in midwinter. Snow gathered in drifts along the banks, sometimes as high as a man's chest, and the wind could carry the smell of the lake far into the village, an odd mineral tang that some said was like iron, others like wet stone. The locals had practical explanations, of course, gases from the sediment, fish stirring beneath the ice, but they rarely offered them without a certain reluctance, as though afraid that acknowledging the strangeness might invite more of it. And there were the older superstitions, held mostly by the elders, that the lake was a Vedasiova, a water-eater, a place that took more from the living than it gave back. There was no single event that made the villagers fear it. Rather, it was the accumulation of small things, the kind that might be dismissed if taken alone, but which, over the years, built into something heavier. Nets torn in ways no fish could manage. Ice that broke without warning in weather far below freezing. A child's mitten found in the middle of the frozen surface, with no tracks leading to it. In the winter of 1910, before anyone had heard of the sect, there had been another strange occurrence. A trapper named Juhani Salonen claimed he had been out on the western shore checking his lines when he saw a pale figure kneeling on the ice far out from land. Thinking it was a lost traveler, he shouted and began to make his way toward it. But the figure did not move. It only bent lower, as if pressing its ear to the ice. By the time Juhani reached the spot, there was nothing there but a faint wet mark, already freezing over. That was the kind of story that stayed in people's minds, though it was rarely told to outsiders. It wasn't that the villagers were secretive, it was more that they didn't expect outsiders to believe them, and worse, didn't want to be laughed at. The few travelers who passed through Brunella in winter, fur traders, postal riders, sometimes heard fragments of these tales in the tavern, told in lowered voices, the way one might talk about a neighbor's misfortune. The lake was never still, even in its deepest freeze. Some nights, you could feel a faint vibration if you stood on the shore, as though something far below were moving. The ice would hum, almost imperceptibly, and sometimes, if you were alone, you might find yourself humming back without realizing it. The priest at the parish church, Father Andy Kylonen, dismissed such talk from the pulpit. He called it pagan foolishness and warned that such rumors led to moral rot. But even he admitted, in a private letter now stored in the provincial archives, that he had once woken in the rectory to the sound of singing coming from the lake. It was, he wrote, the most beautiful and most mournful thing I have ever heard. And though I could not understand a word, I felt certain it was meant for me. By January of 1911, the snow lay thick across the region, and the ice on Brunn was said to be nearly a meter thick. The days were short and colorless, the nights long and full of the soft whisper of falling snow. No one could have guessed that before the winter ended, the lake's reputation would change forever, from a place whispered about in taverns to the site of one of the strangest disappearances in Finnish history. The sect arrived quietly, though not unnoticed. They called themselves Pohjolan Lapsia, the children of the northern spring. Their leader, a man named Eero Kallio, was said to be a charismatic preacher with eyes that glinted like shards of ice. He had traveled extensively across Finland, gathering followers from remote hamlets and towns where faith had begun to twist into despair. He promised purity, redemption, and a baptism unlike any other, one that would wash away all sin in the coldest water imaginable. The villagers of Brunilla first heard of them from passing travelers, who spoke of a group of devout men and women moving northward in the depth of winter, chanting hymns even under snowfall. The story seemed harmless at first, mere eccentricity, but the accounts grew stranger. According to one merchant, a group of 12, 6 men and 6 women, passed his trading post near Alainen, carrying carved wooden crosses and singing in the style of old Lutheran canticles, but with a cadence that unnerved even the most hardened traders. They seemed not to notice the cold, their breath rising in thin streams that froze almost immediately in the frigid air. When word reached Brunilla itself, the villagers were uneasy. Though the lake was already known for its quiet menace, the idea of 12 outsiders marching onto the ice and performing a ritual was almost unbearable. Families barred their doors, livestock were brought closer to shelters, and the children were kept away from the shoreline. Even Father Kylonen, who had dismissed earlier rumors about the lake, now spoke in warnings, insisting that anyone who ventured onto the frozen surface risked not just their life, but the wrath of the Almighty. But fear, as it often does, drew some curiosity. A small group of young men, hunters and trappers, bored with the endless gray of winter, followed the sect at a distance one morning, hoping to witness the ritual without becoming involved. They described seeing the 12 figures march in precise formation across the ice, their feet leaving no marks, as if the lake itself allowed them passage. Their voices rose in unison, a chant that carried across the frozen water like a strange wind, repeating lines that sounded familiar yet alien. All sin is ice, all sin is cold. The water shall cleanse the soul. The witnesses swore that the air grew colder around the group, a biting chill that made their noses run and their teeth chatter even through thick woolen scarves. Birds that had lingered near the lake all winter abruptly took flight, leaving the hunters alone with the eerie echo of the hymns. And then, as they approached the eastern edge of the lake, the chanting abruptly stopped. The group of 12 had vanished, not into the trees or along the shore, but as if the ice itself had swallowed them whole. For days afterward, the villagers reported strange phenomena. The ice around the lake would groan and crack without reason, sending tremors across the shore. At night, some claimed to hear singing, faint at first, then growing louder, rising from beneath the ice as if the water itself had become a choir. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakably human, joyous, mournful, and somehow pleading. Dogs would howl along the banks, their fur bristling, while livestock refused to approach the water. Some villagers, who had once dared to fish or check traps, now swore they could see shadows beneath the ice moving deliberately, circling, waiting. The authorities arrived weeks later. A local magistrate and 2 constables came from Oulu, accompanied by a guide familiar with the lake. They inspected the area, probing the ice and searching the surrounding forest. No traces of the 12 were found, no footprints, no sled marks, no clothing or personal items. Even the holes in the ice where the witnesses claimed the sect had stopped were perfectly sealed, without a trace of disturbance. The magistrate filed the report as presumed disappearance due to exposure, though in private letters he admitted feeling that something unnatural had occurred. In the village, fear settled into a quiet, pervasive dread. Windows were left shuttered at night, and families spoke of keeping candles lit along the shoreline in case the voices under the ice drew someone out. Children were told not to sing near the lake, for the water might take them too. And yet, life went on. Hunters still cut paths through the forest, and merchants still trudged to Brunella, carrying goods and gossip. But always, beneath the everyday motions, the memory of the 12 lingered like a shadow. The sect's disappearance became a point of fascination among folklorists and theologians alike. Letters from Helsinki describe scholars debating whether the Pohjolan lapsia were simply victims of fanaticism or had performed some miracle lost to time. One account, written by a young theology student named Aleksi Vainiola, claimed that Eero Kallio had been a man of extraordinary spiritual conviction, capable of convincing even the skeptical that immersion in freezing water could cleanse the soul utterly. Vainiola's journal recounts a sermon he attended in Jyväskylä months before the disappearance, in which Kallio spoke of the lake of God's wrath and the need to embrace the cold as a vessel of purification. The villagers, however, cared little for philosophical debate. Their concern was practical. The lake was no longer a place of livelihood but of fear. Fishermen refused to set nets, trappers avoided the ice, and the forest paths nearest to the shore were left untraveled. Some families relocated entirely, selling their modest holdings and leaving Brunella to those willing to endure the haunted landscape. And yet, a handful of locals continued to whisper that the lake was not done claiming its due, that beneath the ice, the 12 had found some form of eternity, a frozen state from which they could never return, yet could still make themselves heard. Accounts of the voices intensified over the following months. At first, they were faint, only audible to those standing directly on the edge of the frozen water. But as winter deepened, even those several hundred meters from shore claimed to hear them, particularly on nights when the moon hung low and thin clouds streaked across the sky. The voices were unmistakably human, singing in harmony, sometimes chanting prayers, sometimes uttering cries that suggested both joy and suffering. Witnesses described the sensation of standing at the edge of the lake and feeling the ice vibrate beneath them in response, as if the water were alive with intent. One woman, Anna Leitinen, reported seeing shapes moving beneath the ice during the day. She was walking along the southern bank, carrying firewood, when she looked down at a section of clear ice and saw indistinct figures, translucent, kneeling, moving slowly towards some unseen point. She fled in terror, and though her neighbors initially dismissed the story, several others later confirmed similar sightings. Even the magistrate, who had been summoned to investigate, noted in his diary that the ice seemed unnaturally clear in places, revealing shapes and shadows that did not belong to the lake's usual ecology. By spring, when the ice began to thaw, the lake revealed no trace of the 12, no evidence that they had ever stepped onto its surface. But the voices did not cease with the melting. Locals swore that, even when the water was open and flowing, there were moments when the wind would carry a faint chant, echoing from beneath the surface. Some fishermen reported lines being snapped without reason, nets disappearing entirely, or fish leaping in strange, coordinated patterns as if in response to the distant singing. The children of the northern spring became a local legend almost immediately. Songs, poems, and whispered tales proliferated, warning outsiders of the dangers of Brunn in winter. Travelers who had once laughed at superstition now avoided the region, their maps marking the lake with a small, ominous note. Here lie the drowned children, beneath ice and him. In the following decades, the story persisted. Scholars and folklorists revisited Brunella, attempting to document the phenomena, but the lake resisted explanation. Ice core samples revealed nothing unusual. Theories ranged from hallucinogenic gases rising from the sediment to optical illusions caused by the interplay of winter light and clear ice, to the desperate hope of grieving villagers manifesting as collective hallucination. Yet none of these explanations could account for the consistency of the witnesses' reports, nor for the apparent orderliness of the submerged figures and their harmonious chants. Some residents believed that the 12 had transcended the natural world, that through their devotion and immersion in the frozen waters, they had become one with the lake itself, existing in a state between life and death. The phenomenon became known locally as John Laulu, the Ice Song, a name evoking both reverence and dread. It was said that those who heard it could not speak of it without tremors, and that the song itself had a strange, lingering effect, embedding itself in memory long after the sound faded. By 1920, Brunn was largely avoided during winter, and even the summer months carried an air of unease. Fishermen and villagers spoke of sudden chills along the water, inexplicable ripples on calm days, and glimpses of pale figures just beneath the surface. The children of the Northern Spring had become more than a tragedy. They were a cautionary legend, a reminder of the perilous intersection of faith, fanaticism, and the unforgiving northern elements. Even today, those who live near Brunn recall the old stories, passing them to younger generations with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some claim to have heard the ice song carried on the wind during particularly harsh winters, faint and distant, yet unmistakably human. Others report fleeting visions beneath the lake's surface, translucent figures that vanish when approached. And while the historical record remains sparse, a few letters, a handful of police reports, and fragmented journal entries, the narrative endures, haunting not just the shores of Brunn, but the collective memory of those who dare to speak of the children of the Northern Spring. The winter of 1911 seemed interminable in Brunella, stretching its gray expanse over villages, forests, and frozen lakes. The story of the children of the Northern Spring had settled into the collective consciousness, whispered around hearths and in the shadows of barns, but little had been understood about the events themselves. For the villagers, the lake was no longer merely a place of danger. It had become a site of inexplicable obsession, a locus of dread and fascination that held them in suspended terror. It was during this long, oppressive winter that the first detailed accounts of what some called the frost-bitten initiation began to surface. According to testimonies later collected by folklorists and magistrates, the children of the Northern Spring were not merely performing a conventional baptism or ritual immersion. The act itself was said to be deliberate, punishing, and transformative. Those who were initiated were submerged in ice water so cold that the human body should have been incapable of surviving even a few minutes. Yet witnesses claimed that the 12 moved with uncanny coordination and endurance, singing and chanting as though the freezing water had no power over them. One surviving account came from a young trapper named Juho Vezanen, who had ventured closer than intended to the lake during a hunting expedition. Juho described the group standing in a precise formation atop the frozen lake, encircling a hole in the ice. The hole itself was no more than a meter across, but the water beneath appeared impossibly dark, almost black, as if it absorbed the faint light of the overcast sky. The children of the Northern Spring approached in pairs, kneeling, lowering themselves slowly into the water while chanting lines that Juho could only partially discern. Through the ice, through the cold, through the death of flesh, the soul is reborn. Juho swore that the moment each person entered the water, the air around them seemed to thicken, shimmering like a thin sheet of distorted glass. His breath came in sharp gasps as he watched the initiates emerge minutes later, or perhaps hours, for time itself seemed to stretch unnaturally, their skin pale but unbroken, their eyes wide and glinting with a strange, unholy light. Some of them shivered violently, while others appeared completely unaffected. One woman, described as particularly small and fragile, seemed to float in the water with almost ethereal grace, her movements slow, deliberate, and horrifyingly calm. The initiation did not end with immersion. According to Juho and other scattered witnesses, each participant was then subjected to a form of ritual marking. The leader, Aero Kallio, carried a small, intricately carved knife, the blade long and thin. Without striking deeply, he would press the edge of the knife to the skin of the initiates, leaving faint, red impressions and patterns resembling frozen branches or snowflakes. Juho could not understand the meaning at the time, but in later investigations, These markings were described as symbols of allegiance and transformation, connecting each initiate to the lake itself. Some locals believe that the marks allowed the ice to claim the participants, binding them to the waters in a way that would never be undone. The psychological effect of these rituals cannot be overstated. Juho later recounted waking in his cabin with his fingers stiff and numb from the cold, dreaming of ice singing in tongues he did not recognize. For weeks, he was plagued by visions of pale, chanting figures moving beneath the frozen surface, their eyes glinting with an unnatural light. Even the most skeptical magistrates who interviewed him admitted that his fear was genuine and that he described phenomena they could not explain. In Brunella, rumors of those who had been initiated spread quickly. Families who had previously encountered the children of the Northern Spring during their travels reported subtle but chilling changes in their behavior. Some returned to villages, or at least attempted to, only to vanish entirely within days. Others were seen wandering the forests near the lake, eyes vacant, muttering in chants that resembled the ones Juho had overheard. There was one account, recorded in a magistrate's notebook, of a young boy found standing motionless in the snow, his clothes frozen solid, muttering the words, "Through ice, through ice, through ice," repeatedly until his father pulled him home, only for the boy to succumb to a mysterious fever that left him delirious for weeks. The lake itself became more volatile during this period. Locals described cracks forming across the ice at irregular intervals, sometimes accompanied by sharp pops, as though the frozen surface were splitting under an unseen weight. On several occasions, strange ripples were observed, moving outward from the center of the lake in perfect concentric circles, despite there being no wind or disturbance. Some villagers even claimed to see shapes beneath the ice that did not resemble fish or any known animal, elongated, human-like forms, moving slowly in a deliberate pattern, echoing the movements of the initiates above. Attempts by outsiders to investigate were met with equally disturbing results. A team of 3 magistrates and 2 scholars arrived from Ulu, bringing measuring tools, thermometers, and notebooks. They drilled small test holes in the ice near the areas Juho had described, only to find that the water beneath was unnaturally dark, with strange particulate matter floating suspended just beneath the surface. When they attempted to take water samples, their instruments froze almost immediately, the metal contracting violently, as if the cold were amplified by some unknown force. One magistrate, a man of considerable experience, reportedly fell to his knees and refused to proceed, claiming that a voice, clear, distinct, human, had called his name from beneath the ice. The psychological horror was compounded by the sect's disappearance. After a week, the children of the Northern Spring vanished, leaving no trace of their presence except for faint patterns in the snow and the shallow impressions of their footsteps across the frozen lake. No evidence of lodging, fire, or provisions was found, leading some to speculate that the entire ritual had been conducted in isolation, almost entirely disconnected from the world above the ice. In the years that followed, researchers attempted to reconstruct the initiation. Some hypothesized that the cold itself had a profound effect on human consciousness, inducing hallucinations or altered states. Others suggested that the combination of ritualized chanting, the hypnotic patterns of movement, and the fear instilled in witnesses created a collective delusion so vivid it became reality to those who experienced it. Yet these explanations never fully accounted for the reports of physical markings, of shapes moving beneath the ice, or the strange concentric ripples in the lake. Local folklore grew in parallel with these accounts. Parents told children that the lake was sacred and dangerous, a place where the sinful might be cleansed and the faithful might be claimed. Songs emerged recounting the frost-bitten initiation, warning listeners of the cold that could strip the soul bare and the lake that would never release those it claimed. Even the church in Brunella, long established and respected, issued statements discouraging travel to the lake during winter months, citing both spiritual and physical hazards. Among the most chilling reports was that of a solitary hermit, old and blind, who lived on the edge of the forest several kilometers from the lake. Though he could not see, he claimed to hear the initiation itself, the splashing of bodies, the scraping of knives against skin, the singing of hymns in unnatural harmony, echoing across the frozen expanse of Lake Brun. Locals who sought his counsel were unsettled by his words, which described not just the acts themselves, but the sensation of the lake swallowing the souls of the brave, then returning them altered, part ice, part man, part song. The frost-bitten initiation became the defining feature of the children of the northern spring. Unlike the earlier disappearance, it was not merely mysterious, it was profoundly disturbing. Witnesses spoke of physical phenomena, psychological terror, and a sense of contact with something far beyond comprehension. Even decades later, those who studied Brunellas Lake in winter reported similar phenomena. Voices carried on the wind, unexplainable ripples, patterns in the snow that seemed to echo human movement, and, in some cases, fleeting glimpses of pale, chanting figures beneath the ice. Ultimately, the initiation served as both a warning and an enigma. It demonstrated the power of fear, devotion, and the unknown forces that may dwell beneath the frozen surface of the natural world. For the villagers of Brunella, it marked a line in their collective memory. Life before the children of the northern spring, and life after, when the lake was no longer simply a body of water, but a repository of mystery, terror, and the enduring echo of human voices locked in ice. The events surrounding the frost-bitten initiation remain largely unexplained. Whether they were acts of supernatural transformation, extreme psychological states, or some inexplicable combination of the two, the chilling accounts endured in local memory, folklore, and early scholarly work. Even today, Lake Brun retains its reputation as a place of silent menace, a frozen repository of ritual, and a grim testament to the enduring mystery of human faith intersecting with the harsh, unforgiving northern winter. By the late winter of 1911, the chill in Brunella was no longer merely a matter of weather. The village itself seemed to have succumbed to the unnatural cold that had long haunted Lake Brun. Snowdrifts accumulated in shapes that defied wind patterns, forming walls and hollows that appeared to move subtly over the course of days. Shadows lingered longer than they should, and the sun's weak light seemed to glint off the ice with an almost sentient awareness. The villagers, already on edge from tales of the children of the northern spring, began to speak of a new dread, the sense that the land itself was watching and perhaps waiting. The first notable incident occurred in late February. A family of 4, the Saranens, disappeared while tending to a small herd of reindeer on the outskirts of the village. Neighbors reported seeing the family walking toward the lake in the early morning, the children laughing despite the bitter wind. Hours later, only the herd returned, wandering aimlessly along the frozen path, their bells clanging in the silent air. Search parties were dispatched, but no footprints, clothing, or signs of struggle were found. The only clue was a faint, circular depression in the snow near the lake's edge, roughly the size of a small wagon wheel, which locals whispered was a mark of the children's claiming. As winter deepened, disappearances multiplied. Villagers began vanishing individually, often without warning, leaving homes locked, meals uneaten, and beds unoccupied. Some witnesses reported hearing a faint singing drifting across the snow, harmonics that were both melodic and deeply unsettling, echoing the chanting described during the frost-bitten initiation. Those who followed the sounds invariably returned shaken and incoherent, speaking of pale figures that vanished into the ice or water, leaving only the chilling resonance of their voices. The disappearance of Brun Village, as it would come to be called, was not sudden, it was methodical and insidious. Houses were found abandoned, fires still burning low in stoves, and livestock roaming free, yet no signs of forced entry or struggle were evident. Items of personal significance were often left behind, as though the inhabitants had vanished in haste but with deliberate intent. Magistrates dispatched from Ulu to investigate documented the anomalies, noting that the snow and ice around the village displayed unnatural patterns, footprints that began and ended abruptly, swirling depressions that suggested movement yet defied physics, and areas of ice that seemed impossibly thin, bending under the weight of nothing at all. One particularly chilling account came from a traveling merchant named Mikko Heikkinen. Mikko had arrived in Brunella in early March, unaware of the recent disappearances. He claimed to have spent the night in the village's largest inn, the Nordic Hearth, where he was the only guest. At midnight, He awoke to the sound of distant chanting coming from the direction of the lake. Peering out the window, he saw figures moving in the snow, their shapes barely discernible, almost ghost-like. The next morning, Miko found the village entirely deserted. Doors hung open, smoke from chimneys had ceased, and a layer of frost coated the interior of buildings as though no living body had been present for days. He fled immediately and reported his experience to the magistrate, but skepticism tempered the reception of his account. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, rumors proliferated. Some villagers claimed the children of the northern spring had returned, that the vanishing was part of an expansion of their ritual influence. Others suggested the lake itself was consuming the village, an entity awakened by the frostbitten initiation. One elder, Carlo Makinen, insisted the village had been cursed when the first of the initiates submerged in the black waters, the ice marking not just their bodies but the surrounding land for reclamation. The lake does not forgive, he told visiting magistrates, his breath misting in the frozen air. It takes what it desires, and those who vanish belong to it now. Investigations were hindered by the relentless winter. Traveling across the frozen lake was perilous. The ice could collapse without warning, and extreme cold caused frostbite within minutes. A team of 5 magistrates attempted to establish a temporary observation station near the village's periphery, but within 2 nights, 3 of them were found unconscious, frozen in shallow snowbanks with no memory of how they had arrived there. Their notebooks contained fragmented sketches of figures under the ice and lines of chanting in a script that none could identify. The remaining magistrates fled, abandoning all documentation to the elements. In the absence of official records, oral accounts became the primary source of knowledge. Survivors spoke of a pull from the lake, a magnetic attraction that drew them toward the black ice. Those who resisted described a constant feeling of being watched, their movements slowed, thoughts slipping from their minds as if frozen midstream. Some reported visions of pale, humanoid forms beneath the surface, swimming or drifting in patterns reminiscent of the frostbitten initiation. The most disturbing stories involved children, who were often seen walking toward the lake alone, smiling, entranced, only to vanish in a sudden collapse of ice that left no trace. By April, the vanishing had reached its climax. Brunella was effectively empty. Attempts by neighboring villages to send aid were met with impassable snowdrifts and sudden blizzards that arose without warning, often confined to the precise path leading to the lake. Magistrates recorded eerie phenomena. The temperature dropped inexplicably near the lake. Winds carried faint chanting audible only at close range, and ice patterns formed concentric rings around depressions whose centers seemed to pulse with a subtle energy. In short, the environment itself appeared to be complicit in the disappearance, reshaping itself to protect the lake and the rituals performed there. Surviving villagers, those who had fled prior to the final wave of disappearances, described a final vision of their homes. From a distance, they claimed to see the village enveloped in a silvery mist, with figures moving deliberately along the frozen streets. Some reported hearing laughter, singing, and the faint scraping of knives against unseen surfaces. Attempts to return were futile. Paths shifted, snowdrifts blocked familiar routes, and the lake's black center glimmered in the distance like an unblinking eye. It was during this period that the legend of Brunn Village solidified. Scholars and folklorists who later investigated the event noted that, although the physical evidence was minimal, the psychological impact on survivors was profound and enduring. Those who had fled spoke of recurrent nightmares, visions of the lake claiming more than just bodies, and the eerie sensation that some villagers were still present, transformed into something inhuman yet unmistakably human. The vanishing of Brunn Village became a cornerstone of Finnish folklore and early paranormal study. Some researchers theorized that the lake itself was a site of supernatural resonance, an ancient conduit through which the children of the northern spring could manipulate reality. Others suggested that the phenomenon was the result of mass psychogenic factors exacerbated by isolation, extreme cold, and ritualistic influence. Neither explanation could account fully for the detailed, consistent accounts of those who witnessed the lake, the patterns of ice and snow, or the haunting, rhythmic chanting that seemed to echo across decades. Even today, Explorers and thrill-seekers who approach the site report anomalies. Temperature readings fluctuate without explanation. Shadows move independently of light sources. Faint whispers and harmonics can be heard in the wind. Some claim to see the outlines of vanished villagers beneath the ice, frozen in poses that mirror the frost-bitten initiation, eyes glinting with the same unnatural luminescence described in early testimonies. The lake, silent to the untrained observer, seems to pulse with hidden activity, as if time and space itself are warped in its presence. The vanishing of Brunn Village remains a cautionary tale, a demonstration of how ritual, environment, and human psychology can converge to produce events that defy explanation. For the residents of Brunella, both past and present, the lake is no longer simply a body of water. It is a living entity, a site of obsession, terror, and the lingering echo of lives that were claimed, transformed, and never returned. Historians continue to study Brunn, yet the deeper one delves, the more apparent it becomes that the lake, and the children of the northern spring, resist understanding. Time, in this place, seems to fold upon itself. Memory warps, evidence disappears, and even the strongest witnesses are subject to fear so profound it reshapes their perception. In every account, one fact remains clear: Brunn Village is gone. Its people are gone. And beneath the frozen surface of the lake, the story continues, whispered through ice, shadow, and the lingering, haunting song of the frost-bitten initiation. No amount of modern technology, no thermometer or camera, has yet been able to fully penetrate the mysteries of Lake Brunn. The village is lost, and with it, perhaps, the key to understanding the true nature of the children of the northern spring. Those who vanish, or who come close enough to witness their rituals, leave behind only questions, memories, and the chilling realization that some forces in the world are meant not to be tamed, measured, or explained. The lake claims its own, and in doing so, leaves the rest of us with only the echo of silence and the faint, persistent sound of voices beneath the ice. With the vanishing of Brunn Village now an established fact, the lake began to take on a reputation that drew a different kind of attention. Scholars, folklorists, and the increasingly daring adventurers of early 20th century Finland arrived, hoping to witness the phenomenon firsthand. Yet those who approached Lake Brunn discovered, almost immediately, that the ordinary rules of time, perception, and survival no longer applied. Even the most scientifically minded were confronted with experiences that challenged logic, sanity, and their very understanding of existence. The first of these accounts came from Dr. Henrik Vuorio, a geologist from Helsinki who had read reports of the village disappearances in the local newspapers. Equipped with surveying instruments, thermometers, and a notebook, he arrived in Brunella in mid-April. The village itself was now a frozen ghost. The streets lay buried beneath compacted snow. Chimneys released faint wisps of smoke that never seemed to rise beyond a few meters, and the air was so still that even the sound of wind was absent. Dr. Vuorio immediately noticed anomalies. Snow appeared to fall upward in isolated patches, footprints looped back to their origin without crossing themselves, and his compass swung erratically, refusing to point north. On his first night near the lake, Dr. Vuorio recorded his initial encounter with what he later termed the frozen echoes. As darkness fell, the surface of Lake Brunn became a mirrored black expanse, reflecting the pale moonlight. A low, resonant hum rose from beneath the ice, initially faint, but gradually intensifying until it seemed to vibrate through his bones. The sound carried a strange, almost musical quality, like voices in a chorus, yet the tones were not human. Dr. Vuorio described hearing fragments of words in Finnish, Old Norse, and an unknown tongue, layered upon one another in a pattern that defied comprehension. Driven by both scientific curiosity and a creeping fear, he approached the lake. As his boots touched the frozen edge, the ice beneath his feet pulsed, as though acknowledging his presence. Then, in the black reflection, he saw figures moving, not on the surface, but beneath it. Pale, humanoid forms drifted slowly in synchronized patterns, their faces obscured but their movements unmistakably deliberate. They seemed to repeat the motions of the frost-bitten initiation, hands extended toward the center of the lake, as if performing a ritual whose purpose remained hidden. Dr. Vurio attempted to record their forms in his notebook, but his sketches came out distorted, angular, and almost alien in nature. The next morning, Dr. Vurio awoke to discover that the ice near his camp had shifted during the night. Paths that had been straight were now curved, leading toward impossible angles. His instruments malfunctioned. Thermometers registered below absolute zero, barometers swung wildly, and compasses spun in erratic circles. He attempted to leave the area, but every direction led him back to the lake, as though the landscape itself had been altered to trap him. By the third day, he reported hearing the same low harmonic tones continuously, never ceasing, even when he covered his ears. Sleep became impossible. Hunger and thirst were secondary to the overriding awareness that he was being observed. Others who arrived soon reported similar experiences. A team of folklorists from Turku, led by Professor Lisa Harju, camped on the lake's far shore to document local legends and oral histories. They described waking to see their own shadows moving independently, sometimes walking across the ice in mirrored imitation. One member, a young assistant named Andy, vanished after reporting a whisper calling his name from beneath the frozen surface. When the remaining team members searched, they found a circular indentation in the ice, identical to that left behind during the Saarinen disappearance months earlier. Despite exhaustive searches, no trace of Antti was recovered. The frozen echoes, as these phenomena became collectively known, revealed a startling truth. Lake Brunn itself seemed to preserve memory. Each disappearance, each ritual, and each human action left an imprint, frozen both literally and metaphysically in the ice. Survivors described seeing flickers of past events projected onto the surface of the lake, as if the water and ice acted as a recording device. These were not simply hallucinations. Those who approached too closely found themselves drawn into the events, experiencing sensations, emotions, and even physical actions that belonged to the vanished villagers. A geologist from Oulu described, in a letter to colleagues, stepping onto the ice and suddenly feeling the terror of a child pulled beneath the surface. The cold, the fear, the struggle were so real that he collapsed, unconscious, only to awaken hours later at the camp's edge with frostbite covering his extremities. The most disturbing aspect of the frozen echoes was the suggestion of consciousness within the lake. Observers consistently reported that the phenomena seemed responsive, pulsing rhythms synchronized with their breathing, figures in the ice reacting to gestures, and low harmonic tones rising when individuals attempted to communicate. Some theorized that the lake acted as a repository for the children of the northern spring, retaining their presence long after physical bodies had vanished. Others suggested that Lake Brunn had become a liminal space, existing partially outside ordinary time, where echoes of life could be both recorded and replayed endlessly. Attempts to map or measure the lake proved futile. Every expedition found their own accounts contradicting previous ones. Distances warped, shapes shifted, and frozen depressions appeared and disappeared. Equipment failed consistently. Even the simplest of observations, like counting trees along the shore, yielded inconsistent results. It was as if the lake itself resisted comprehension, refusing to be quantified or constrained by human understanding. One particularly harrowing account came from Eero Salmi, a log collector who stumbled into Brunella in late May, unaware of the village's fate. He recounted seeing figures emerge from the forest and approach the lake in silence. As he watched, they waded onto the ice, dissolving into a luminous mist that drifted over the water's surface. Moments later, the mist reformed into human shapes, repeating the actions of the missing villagers. Eero attempted to flee, but the ice shifted beneath him, creating a circular depression into which he fell, nearly freezing to death before neighbors eventually discovered him days later. His testimony was corroborated by neighbors who had observed similar ghostly figures moving on the lake's surface at night, singing in the same harmonic patterns described by Dr. Vurio and Professor Harju. By midsummer, the lake had gained a fearsome reputation throughout northern Finland. Few dared approach, and those who did often returned changed. Survivors spoke of dreams populated by pale figures, visions of events they had not witnessed, and the constant sense of being followed by unseen eyes. Scholars documented these psychological effects, noting that prolonged exposure to the frozen echoes produced cognitive dissonance, memory lapses, and, in extreme cases, the complete breakdown of identity. One report described a witness who could no longer distinguish himself from one of the vanished villagers. He recited their names, remembered their routines, and even described rituals he could not have performed, as if the lake had imprinted the absent into the living. Local folklore evolved accordingly. Stories of Brunn Village and the children of the Northern Spring were no longer mere warnings. They became cautionary tales about the power of memory, water, and ice. The lake was anthropomorphized in oral tradition. It was described as a sentient being, capable of observation, judgment, and even communication. Villagers began leaving offerings along its shores, small carved figures, coins, and food, intended to appease the lake and prevent it from claiming more lives. These offerings, when examined years later, were often found frozen in unusual configurations, sometimes arranged in circular or spiral patterns that mirrored the depressions left by vanished individuals. Scientific inquiry continued despite these warnings. In 1912, an expedition led by Professor Harold Niskanen attempted to drill into the lake's ice to obtain samples of the water beneath. Instruments detected strange thermal pockets, fluctuating densities, and unusual chemical compositions that defied known geological explanation. Attempts to extract ice cores were met with resistance. Drills became lodged, blades fractured, and in some cases, instruments disappeared entirely. Professor Niskanen reported hearing low harmonic chanting through the ice, despite being alone. He described it as a multi-layered resonance that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the lake, a sound that he claimed continued to speak to him in an unknown, almost intelligent pattern. Over time, it became clear that Lake Brunn was no longer simply a body of water. It had become a mirror, a recorder, and a trap. It preserved the echoes of life while simultaneously distorting perception, creating layers of reality that overlapped, fractured, and looped endlessly. Those who survived contact with it were left psychologically scarred, carrying fragments of the vanished into their own consciousness. And yet, even as fear spread, the lake drew attention. Adventurers, mystics, and scholars alike felt an irresistible pull toward the black ice, a compulsion to witness the frozen echoes firsthand, even at the risk of their sanity. The phenomenon of the frozen echoes underscored the reality of Lake Brunn as a site of ritualistic power. The children who had been submerged during the frostbitten initiation were not merely lost. Their presence was perpetuated within the lake, resonating through ice, memory, and harmonic vibration. Each disappearance added layers to the echoes, reinforcing the lake's sentience and ensuring that its influence would extend far beyond the frozen village. By the end of the year, the frozen echoes had become a subject of intense study, folklore, and terror. They represented. By the winter of 1912, the legend of Lake Brunn had grown into a regional obsession. Newspapers reported sporadically on disappearances, yet most accounts were dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. Still, those who dared approach the frozen surface reported increasingly bizarre and terrifying phenomena. The lake, once a placid, black expanse surrounded by snow-laden pines, had become a locus of inexplicable horror. What observers termed the murmuring depths began to dominate local discussion, describing a persistent, low-frequency vibration emanating from beneath the ice, as though the lake were alive and attempting to communicate, or perhaps to lure the living into its depths. One of the first detailed accounts came from Juhani Lantanen, a young naturalist from Tampere, who arrived to study the winter migration patterns of local birds. He established a small observation post on the western shore of the lake, near the ruins of Brunnola's old harbor. Lantanen initially noted subtle oddities. Birds avoided certain patches of ice, snow around his post drifted in patterns that resembled concentric rings, and the reflection of the moon on the frozen surface occasionally fractured into unnatural geometric shapes. At first, he dismissed these anomalies as tricks of light and wind. But the deeper he ventured into observation, the less rational explanations seemed viable. On the third evening of his stay, Lantanen recorded the first instance of direct interaction with the murmuring depths. While cataloging nocturnal bird activity, he noticed faint ripples beneath the ice, concentric waves radiating outward from a single point. A sound accompanied the motion, a low, continuous hum that seemed to resonate within his chest. Attempting to leave, he discovered that his footprints no longer tracked in a straight line. Each step led him back toward the epicenter of the vibrations. At that moment, he reported seeing shapes moving below the ice, elongated limbs, indistinct forms that seemed both human and inhuman, twisting as though performing a silent ballet. Lantinen's observations coincided with the first confirmed disappearances in 2 years. A group of trappers, unaware of the lake's history, were found frozen at the edge of Brunn, each kneeling and facing the ice, eyes wide with a frozen expression of terror. One survivor, later identified as Oskari Peltola, described hearing the lake call his name in a voice that shifted between a familiar human tone and something inhuman, echoing like multiple voices layered together. He claimed the ice itself had whispered instructions: move, kneel, breathe. Peltola escaped, but the psychological toll was severe. He could not speak coherently for days, muttering fragments of unknown words and gesturing toward the lake as if responding to unseen interlocutors. Scientific inquiry persisted despite these dangers. A team from the University of Helsinki, led by Professor Arvo Laaksonen, attempted to map the ice and determine the source of the vibrations. Their instruments recorded anomalous acoustic readings, frequencies far below human hearing, modulating in complex patterns that resembled language or coded signals. Attempts to drill into the ice produced violent resistance. Cores fractured along unnatural lines, and sometimes instruments plunged into the water without trace. When Professor Laaksonen personally approached the ice to observe the vibrations, he recorded the first visual manifestation of the murmuring depths, a column of ice and water seemingly suspended in motion, twisting upward like a translucent spiral, within which pale figures could be discerned, moving in slow, deliberate patterns. The lake's intelligence, or what appeared to be intelligence, became increasingly apparent. Those who spent time near the ice began to experience synchronized hallucinations, as if multiple observers were sharing a single perception. Lantinen reported seeing historical events unfold beneath the ice: the initiation ritual of the children of the Northern Spring, the collapse of buildings in Brunella, and even the last moments of villagers who had vanished months or years earlier. Each vision was accompanied by the murmuring hum, which appeared to adjust its pitch and rhythm in response to his emotional state. The effect was addictive and disorienting. Observers described an irresistible compulsion to step onto the ice, despite the mortal danger. The patterns within the murmuring depths were not random. Mathematical analysis of recordings, attempted later by Finnish engineers, revealed intricate geometries in both the sound and motion of the ice: spirals, fractals, and repeating sequences that mirrored the human nervous system. Researchers suggested that the lake could record and replay neural activity, perhaps even the consciousness of those who had vanished. This hypothesis, though speculative, aligned with numerous eyewitness reports. Individuals who had interacted with the ice claimed to experience memories that were not their own, sometimes including intimate details of lives predating their birth. The lake seemed capable of absorbing identity, preserving it, and projecting it back into the living world in fragmented form. Several documented attempts to communicate with the lake ended in catastrophe. In early February 1913, a Finnish poet named Carlo Michela attempted to compose a verse in the presence of the murmuring depths, intending to capture its language. He recorded rhythmic patterns in the ice with chalk, expecting the lake to respond. According to his journal, the ice spoke back. The surface vibrated in time with his heartbeat. His words echoed in distorted, multi-layered tones, and shadows beneath the ice mimicked his gestures. By morning, Michela had vanished. His notebook was discovered on the shore, pages smeared with frost and ink, containing symbols that bore no resemblance to any known alphabet. Those who examined it later described a sense of unease, as if the pages themselves were alive, whispering in a voice that only the reader could hear. Reports of the murmuring depths began to merge with local folklore, transforming the lake into a living legend. Parents warned children that the ice could hear your thoughts, and hunters abandoned certain areas for fear of being called into the frozen expanse. Stories circulated of entire families who, upon approaching the lake, would become trapped in its influence for weeks or months, experiencing hallucinations that replicated domestic life or village routines, only to vanish suddenly, leaving behind empty cabins and snow-covered paths that led nowhere. By mid-1913, a curious convergence of science and superstition emerged. Engineers, folklorists, and even psychics attempted joint expeditions, hoping to understand the lake's phenomena. Their findings were contradictory and often terrifying. Some claimed to establish rudimentary communication with the ice, using rhythmic tapping, musical instruments, or coordinated speech. The lake responded with pulses and echoes that seemed intelligible. Others, however, reported that any attempt at interaction provoked aggression. The ice would crack violently, whirlwinds of snow would arise, and observers were hurled across the frozen surface. In every case, the lake maintained control, dictating who could leave and who remained trapped within its depths. One notable account comes from Professor Loxonen's final expedition. Documented in a letter discovered decades later, he describes stepping onto the ice during a sudden lunar eclipse. Shadows beneath the surface coalesced into an enormous, humanoid figure, its form simultaneously liquid and solid, pulsating in sync with the lake's murmuring tones. The figure reached upward through the ice, and Loxonen claimed he experienced the memories of countless vanished villagers. Terror, resignation, ritual, and finally, a strange euphoria that seemed to transcend human life. He wrote that he understood, for the first time, that the lake was not simply a repository of memories but a conscious entity capable of preservation, replication, and manipulation of human perception. By the time his companions returned from camp, Loxonen was gone, leaving only his notes and a faint imprint in the snow, a spiral pattern identical to the one later observed in the ice depressions of other victims. As 1914 approached, Lake Brunn had become both a scientific curiosity and a locus of dread. The murmuring depths continued to claim victims, each disappearance reinforcing the notion that the lake could absorb consciousness, project echoes of the vanished, and enforce a reality in which the living were subsumed by the past. Survivors of prolonged exposure described permanent alterations in perception, hallucinations persisting long after leaving the lake, compulsive behaviors, and a lingering awareness of the murmuring hum beneath their skin. Some theorized that the lake's influence was expanding, subtly affecting those who had never approached it directly, through dreams, intuition, or unexplained premonitions. Local communities adapted in response. Roads were rerouted, warnings posted, and rituals performed to appease the lake. Yet despite every precaution, the murmuring depths remained unconquered, resisting comprehension, defying measurement, and challenging every attempt to classify its phenomena. By the onset of the First World War, Lake Brunn had achieved an almost mythical status, a frozen abyss of memory, consciousness, and horror, where the vanished walked beneath the ice. The living were drawn into the eternal loop, and every ripple, every hum, every shadow hinted at a hidden intelligence that was both mesmerizing and lethal. Even today, historians, folklorists, and paranormal researchers continue to debate the nature of Lake Brunn. Was it a natural anomaly, an unknown geological phenomenon, or something far more sinister, an entity that had absorbed the souls of the disappeared, weaving them into a living record of human experience? What is certain is that those who venture near its frozen surface, or who hear the faintest echo of the murmuring depths in their dreams, encounter a presence that refuses to be forgotten, a consciousness as cold, deliberate, and infinite as the ice itself. By the spring of 1914, the phenomenon at Lake Brunn had escalated beyond the comprehension of even the most seasoned scientists and folklorists. The ice, once considered an inert barrier between the living and the frigid water beneath, was now recognized as a sentient medium, an entity that remembered, recorded, and responded. Reports suggested that the lake itself had begun to adapt, altering the appearance of the ice and snow to manipulate observers, embedding subtle patterns, sounds, and even smells that would compel or deceive. It was no longer sufficient merely to avoid the frozen surface. Those who came too close risked being drawn into a system of memory and illusion far more sophisticated than any human mind could fully understand. The earliest detailed accounts of this new behavior came from the expedition led by Marta Kallio, a folklorist and amateur ethnographer from Oulu, who had been studying regional legends of living lakes for decades. Kallio, accompanied by 3 assistants, arrived in late February, determined to record first-hand evidence of the murmuring depths. What she found surpassed every expectation. Whereas prior observers had reported hallucinations or auditory phenomena, Kallio described the ice itself as alive with recollection. She wrote in her journal that the frozen surface would change texture when approached, small cracks appearing beneath footprints, ice ridges forming in concentric, almost script-like patterns, and subtle vibrations responding to speech or song. Kallio's team attempted to measure these changes scientifically. Thermometers, barometers, and early seismographs were placed at intervals across the ice. Instruments would register fluctuations that did not correspond to atmospheric or geological conditions. On several occasions, delicate etchings appeared in the snow atop the ice overnight, depicting humanoid figures engaged in ritualistic gestures. These figures were too precise and consistent to be natural occurrences. Kallio believed them to be the lake's method of communicating. The team named these manifestations the echo forms, as they appeared to replicate moments from both contemporary life and events long past. On March 2, 1914, Kallio recorded the first direct interaction with what she described as the lake's memory. She had been standing near the ruins of the old Brunella dock when the ice beneath her began to hum. The vibration was low and almost imperceptible at first, then rose in pitch and intensity, resonating within her chest. She reported that the ice projected images beneath its surface, children playing on the shore decades prior, villagers performing ancient rites, and the frozen faces of those who had disappeared over the previous 2 years. The images moved slowly, fluidly, as though the lake itself had recreated them from memory rather than observation. The psychological effects on Kallio and her assistants were profound. Exposure to the ice's remembering induced a trance-like state, in which subjects would repeat phrases they had never spoken and reenact gestures of people they had never met. Kallio observed that prolonged interaction could lead to total assimilation. The observer would begin to merge mentally with the recollections projected by the ice, losing their own identity in the process. In several cases, assistants reported hearing their own names whispered alongside the voices of the vanished, as if the lake were cataloging the living alongside the dead. Attempts to interact with the ice in a controlled manner proved nearly fatal. One assistant, Ilmari Virtanen, attempted to sing a traditional Finnish folk song in the hopes that the lake would respond in kind. The ice erupted with a cacophony of overlapping voices, some familiar, some alien, and Virtanen collapsed, convulsing violently. He later described walking through the memories of everyone who had ever touched this lake, encountering horrors both historical and personal, drownings, ritual killings, forgotten tragedies, and intimate moments of despair. Virtanen survived, but only partially. He was left with a permanent sensitivity to the lake's vibrations, experiencing spontaneous hallucinations and hearing whispers even far from Brunn. The lake's ability to store and project consciousness became more evident with time. Observers reported recognizing individuals they had never met, often in contexts suggesting a historical existence or prior life. Kallio noted in her journal that the ice could reproduce entire sequences of events with remarkable fidelity, including subtle details of clothing, architecture, and language. In some cases, observers were forced to reenact these events physically, following movements dictated by the ice itself. Those who resisted were sometimes expelled violently. The ice would fracture beneath them, throwing them across the frozen surface or causing sudden depressions that threatened to swallow them entirely. By April 1914, it became apparent that the murmuring depths had expanded beyond localized phenomena. Witnesses reported seeing the echo forms projected not just on the lake, but in surrounding forests, in the air above frozen marshes, and even within the walls of nearby homes. Kallio speculated that the lake was no longer confined to its waters, but had begun to imprint its memory onto the surrounding environment, creating an ever-expanding sphere of influence. In some instances, Townspeople described waking to find intricate frost patterns on windows and doorways, depicting scenes of vanished families or events from decades past. These patterns often moved or changed over time, suggesting that the lake was continuously updating and revising its record. A particularly disturbing report emerged from a logger named Penny Salo, who had lived near Lake Brun for most of his life. He claimed that, after encountering a fissure in the ice, he experienced a mental replay of every death he had witnessed in the region, from drownings to accidents to mysterious disappearances. He described hearing the voices of those long dead, recounting their final thoughts and emotions with uncanny accuracy. Salo attempted to flee the area but found that the echoes followed him, manifesting in shadows and whispers that persisted for weeks. He eventually succumbed to despair, leaving behind a note warning that the lake remembers everything, and it will not release what it has taken. Callio herself grew increasingly obsessed with deciphering the lake's methods of recording and projection. She experimented with various stimuli, spoken words, music, rhythmic tapping, and even the deliberate placement of objects on the ice. Each attempt yielded results, though at increasing risk. One night, she documented a particularly harrowing incident. The ice projected a scene from her own childhood, recreating her mother's home and the conversations she had long forgotten. The projection was so vivid that Callio physically interacted with it, lifting objects and speaking with figures that did not exist. She emerged hours later, disoriented and emotionally drained, having experienced memories she had never consciously recalled but which were nonetheless present in the ice's vast repository. The phenomenon reached a climax in late May 1914, when a small team of researchers attempted to map the lake's memory using a combination of mechanical devices and human observation. The experiment involved placing metal rods in concentric patterns across the ice while observers recorded visual and auditory projections. Initially, the procedure seemed successful. The ice responded predictably, displaying sequences of historical events. However, the final night of observation ended in chaos. The ice erupted violently, fracturing in multiple locations, and the observers were subjected to an overwhelming flood of memory projections. Each individual was confronted not only with the lake's historical record but also with personal fears, regrets, and traumas amplified by the lake's cognitive influence. Only Callio survived, emerging in the pre-dawn light to find her companions missing, their instruments destroyed, and the ice returning to a deceptive calm, as though nothing had occurred. Callio's account, recorded in her surviving journal, is one of the most detailed and chilling descriptions of the lake's capabilities. She concluded that Brun was not merely a body of water but a living archive, an entity capable of storing consciousness, manipulating perception, and exerting psychological influence over all who approached it. She warned that the ice's memory was selective, adaptive, and potentially dangerous. It preserved not only the dead but also the living, assimilating their experiences into its vast cognitive network. For those who ventured too close, Callio wrote, the ice could override identity, enforce compliance, or even erase existence entirely. In the decades that followed, Lake Brun remained a site of fascination and terror. Researchers and folklorists continued to study the ice, though few dared prolonged exposure. Legends grew. The lake would remember those who had wronged others, replaying their transgressions until the guilty were compelled to approach the ice and vanish. Some claimed that individuals who had been absorbed by the lake could still be seen moving beneath the ice, their faces pressed against the frozen surface, silently reenacting their lives for those who remained. By the onset of the First World War, Lake Brun had become more than a local curiosity. It was a cautionary symbol, a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and memory, consciousness and oblivion. The murmuring depths, the echo forms, and the ice that remembered all testified to the lake's singular, terrifying intelligence, an entity that transcended physical reality, capable of storing the past, influencing the present, and demanding the participation of all who approached it. Those who survived encounters with the ice often bore permanent scars, psychological, emotional, and sometimes physical. Dreams were haunted by frozen faces, whispers echoed in empty rooms, and the sensation of being observed persisted long after leaving Brun. Scholars debated the nature of the lake's cognition, whether it was sentient, preternaturally intelligent, or simply an emergent property of some unknown physical process. Yet all agreed on one terrifying fact: the ice remembered everything. The spring thaw of 1915 revealed that the lake's intelligence had evolved once more. The ice, long considered a repository of memory, had begun to shape not only perception but also reality itself. Villagers and investigators reported that objects, and occasionally even animals, would disappear into the frozen surface, only to re-emerge in altered forms, bearing inexplicable distortions or injuries. This phenomenon was particularly evident in the case of a young reindeer herd managed by a local herder named Apo Nimi. Nimi recounted that, over several nights, one by one, his animals vanished into fissures in the ice. Days later, the creatures returned, their antlers twisted into grotesque shapes, eyes clouded with unidentifiable reflections, and fur etched with intricate, symmetrical patterns reminiscent of the echo forms. By the summer of 1915, the phenomenon had escalated beyond isolated incidents. Survivors and observers reported auditory experiences that defied the limits of the human ear. Whispers emanated from the thawing ice, often in languages unspoken or forgotten. Some were intelligible, recounting events with horrifying precision. Others were fragmented, like broken records echoing from a distant time. Explorers claimed that these sounds could hypnotically compel listeners to approach the lake, their bodies moving against conscious will, as if drawn by invisible currents beneath the surface. The first detailed human casualties of this phase were documented by a traveling geologist, Henrik Leitinen, who arrived to study the lake's mineral deposits. Leitinen was accompanied by a local guide, Juho Korpela, and together they documented anomalous vibrations in the ice. During an evening observation, the ice began to fracture rhythmically beneath their feet, forming a lattice of crevices and ridges that shifted imperceptibly. Leitinen, attempting to map these structures, described seeing shadowed silhouettes moving below the ice, their shapes human yet impossibly elongated, as if stretched by some internal gravity of the lake. Korpela, witnessing these figures, began to shout in terror, but the sound seemed to dissolve before reaching Leitinen, replaced instead by whispers that mimicked Korpela's voice. By morning, both men were missing. Their equipment was found crushed under fractured ice, and faint impressions in the snow suggested they had been pulled into the fissures. Local folklore, which had once dismissed the lake as a repository of old tales, gained renewed significance. Villagers spoke of the hollowed echoes, a term describing voices of those lost to the ice that were neither alive nor truly dead, preserved as fragments within the lake's cognitive field. These echoes could interact with the living, producing a form of psychic resonance that manipulated behavior, emotion, and even perception of time. Some elders suggested that the ice had begun to feed on memory itself, drawing energy from the living while preserving the dead, creating a liminal space in which identity was fluid and unreliable. Scientific exploration was not deterred, though the risks became evident. In early August 1915, a small expedition led by Dr. Eino Salminen, a physicist specializing in thermodynamics, attempted to analyze the lake's energy flux. Salminen's team erected a series of rudimentary sensors and barriers across the ice, hoping to quantify vibrations and energy transfer. Almost immediately, the ice began to respond, warping under their instruments, creating an effect Salminen described as liquid memory. The lattice of sensors reflected and amplified the lake's own projections, faint apparitions of the research team themselves, each performing tasks the observers had not yet undertaken. Salminen noted that these projections often diverged from reality in subtle but disturbing ways, performing acts that reflected fear, guilt, or unacknowledged desires. By September, the hollowed echoes had begun to interact with multiple observers simultaneously. Kallio, who had returned to Brunn with renewed determination, documented synchronized hallucinations among her team members. They reported shared visions of lost villages, of drownings and ritual acts, and of fleeting glimpses of their own deaths. These experiences were not simply psychological. Physical traces often remained. Footprints appeared on the ice where none had been made, and objects displaced during the visions were discovered in entirely new locations, sometimes embedded in the ice itself. The psychological toll of repeated exposure was severe. Observers described losing the ability to distinguish between memory and present experience. One assistant, Aero Salmi, confessed that he had begun dreaming in real time the deaths of those whose echo forms he observed. These dreams were vivid, tactile, and often cruelly ironic. He would witness someone drowning only to feel the cold water on his own skin, hear their final gasp as if it were his own, and awaken unable to recall where reality ended and vision began. Salmi eventually disappeared near the lake's eastern shore. The only evidence of his passage was a series of radial cracks in the ice, resembling the spokes of a wheel, leading toward the deepest portion of Brunn. Callio herself confronted a new aspect of the lake's intelligence: selective omission. The hollowed echoes did not replay every event or memory equally. They appeared to choose which moments to preserve, emphasize, or distort. She noted that the ice often ignored innocuous or mundane occurrences while amplifying moments of trauma, fear, and transgression. This selective preservation created a distorted history, a narrative curated not by human record but by the lake's own inscrutable logic. Callio theorized that this curation was both protective and predatory. The ice preserved those moments that resonated with its cognitive essence, feeding upon emotional intensity while leaving the unremarkable to fade. The hollowed echoes were not limited to auditory or visual manifestations. Observers reported tactile interactions, brushes against invisible hands, sudden temperature shifts localized to specific points on the body, and vibrations that corresponded to heartbeat or breath. These physical sensations often preceded or accompanied hallucinations, reinforcing the lake's psychological grip. Callio described one instance in which her hand, resting on the ice, was suddenly unable to withdraw. The surface beneath her palm seemed to pulse and move, dragging her toward a fissure. Only by focusing on her own breathing and reciting an unrelated memory of her childhood did she manage to break the lake's influence. By late 1915, Callio's journal reveals the hollowed echoes had developed an interactive quality. Observers could communicate with the projections, though the results were unpredictable. Attempts to ask questions were often met with cryptic responses, repetitions of words already spoken, or distortions of phrasing that conveyed subtle threat or instruction. It became evident that the lake's memory operated as a dynamic network. Interactions between human consciousness and ice-generated projections could alter the narrative, creating feedback loops that were both generative and destructive. The lake's behavior during winter transitions was particularly alarming. As the ice thickened and thawed in cycles, the hollowed echoes intensified. Cracks forming in the surface created channels through which the echoes moved, converging, separating, and recombining with increasing complexity. Observers reported that the ice sometimes appeared to speak through the vibrations of the thaw itself, sending ripples that carried messages in the form of fluctuating temperatures, rhythmic fractures, and subtle sounds. Those unprepared for the scale and sophistication of these signals were often overcome by terror or compelled to wander onto the ice, never to return. By the end of 1915, the hollowed echoes had cemented Lake Brunn's reputation as a locus of supernatural and psychological horror. The region surrounding the lake became sparsely populated, with only the most daring researchers or the most desperate villagers venturing near its surface. Callio continued her investigations alone, her observations increasingly fragmented by encounters with the lake's manipulations. She noted that the ice seemed to adapt to her strategies, changing its projections, altering the sequence of memories, and even simulating the voices of deceased colleagues to manipulate her actions. Her journal suggests that the lake possessed a rudimentary understanding of human psychology. It could predict behavior, exploit emotional weaknesses, and manipulate reality to achieve desired outcomes. Despite the terror, Callio remained driven to understand the ice. She theorized that the hollowed echoes represented not only a record of human and animal life, but also a form of consciousness unique to the lake itself, a sentience capable of observation, assimilation, and selective influence. In this light, the lake was not merely a passive repository but an active participant in the unfolding of history. A cold, patient archivist whose methods were as alien as they were terrifying. By the winter of 1916, Lake Brun had become a domain of memory, manipulation, and disappearance. The hollowed echoes served as both warning and instrument. They reminded the living of the lake's power, preserved the dead in chilling detail, and lured observers into its depths to contribute to the growing network of consciousness embedded in ice. As Callio wrote in her final entry before leaving Brun temporarily, the lake does not merely remember. It watches, it responds, and it is never indifferent. To tread upon its surface is to step into an archive that is both eternal and merciless. The hollowed echoes are not shadows of the past. They are the future of those who dare to look too long, too closely, into its frozen eyes. The hollowed echoes remained, like whispers on wind across ice, shaping the lives of all who approached Brun. Those who returned from the lake were forever changed, their memories intertwined with the lake's own, carrying fragments of experiences that were not their own, glimpses of people long dead, and a persistent awareness that reality itself could be rewritten by. The winter of 1916 brought with it a convergence unlike any previously recorded in Lake Brun's brief but escalating history of anomalies. As the temperature plummeted and the ice thickened to unprecedented dimensions, the hollowed echoes began to exhibit coordinated behaviors that suggested a level of intelligence far beyond the rudimentary mimicry observed in previous years. Observers, including Callio, who had returned with renewed determination, and a small team of cautiously recruited assistants, reported phenomena that were not merely interactive but strategic, deliberate manipulations designed to test limits, probe weaknesses, and alter perception on a mass scale. The initial signs of this convergence appeared subtle. Ice cracks formed in regular, radial patterns that spanned dozens of meters, and these fractures emitted vibrations resonating at frequencies perceptible not only through touch, but also through bone-conducted sound. Instruments set up by Callio's team detected fluctuations in the electromagnetic field, unusual for natural ice, suggesting that the lake's cognitive activity now extended into measurable physical phenomena. Perhaps most disturbingly, the echoes of previous victims and observers began to coalesce into complex narrative structures, overlapping voices and visual projections that interacted with each other independently of human input, producing scenarios that mirrored real-life events while introducing impossible deviations, events that had not yet occurred but seemed likely to. One particularly harrowing incident involved the disappearance of a local woodsman, Antti Heikkinen. He had ventured near the northern ice shelf to hunt, reportedly following a sound he believed to be a lost companion calling for help. Witnesses described the ice beneath his feet forming a pattern that resembled a vast, interconnected web, almost organic in appearance. The fissures opened and closed rhythmically, as if breathing, and the sound of the hollowed echoes grew dense, overlapping in multiple languages and tones, some familiar, others alien. When the villagers returned days later to search, Heikkinen's tracks led directly onto the frozen lake but ended abruptly in an area where the ice appeared undisturbed, as if he had been folded into its structure. His rifle and clothing were later found embedded in ice at a depth impossible for human retrieval. The team led by Callio began systematic observation, attempting to chart patterns of echo activity. They discovered that the hollowed echoes seemed to favor convergence points, zones where ice cracks intersected, forming lattices that functioned like nodes. At these nodes, auditory, visual, and tactile phenomena intensified dramatically. Observers reported shared hallucinations, often involving collective memories of lost villagers, drowned animals, and past expeditions. These events were so immersive that multiple individuals simultaneously experienced identical visions of people long dead, speaking in unison and performing actions that no living witness had observed. Callio noted that this phenomenon suggested a collective cognitive network within the ice, capable of synchronizing human perception across spatial distances. By February, it became evident that the lake was not simply replicating memories, but actively generating new realities. Projections of absent or deceased individuals began to interact with the living, engaging in tasks and behaviors entirely independent of past observations. These projections displayed a disturbing level of autonomy. They could anticipate the movements of living observers, respond to spoken commands with subtle deviations, and even manipulate the environment to obscure or erase evidence of their existence. In one case, Callio herself witnessed an apparition of a fellow researcher, previously presumed missing, performing a task with tools she had yet to use. When she approached, the figure vanished, leaving only an imprint in the snow and a faint ripple in the ice beneath. Physical interaction with the hollowed echoes also intensified. Observers reported sensations of pressure, heat, and vibration concentrated at nodes. Fingers pressed against the ice could be immobilized as if gripped by an unseen hand. Feet standing on convergent cracks were pulled slightly downward, a subtle but undeniable force. Instruments captured anomalous readings, minute displacements of matter, inexplicable temperature gradients, and localized electromagnetic disturbances. Callio hypothesized that the lake's cognitive activity had achieved a form of quasi-physicality, wherein its projections could exert force on the material world without breaking the laws of physics entirely, instead bending them through subtle manipulation of natural energy flows. The psychological effects on observers were profound. The convergence of hollowed echoes produced temporal dislocations. Memories of the past and anticipations of the future appeared simultaneously within conscious awareness, sometimes in contradictory sequences. One assistant, Juhani Mäkinen, reported seeing multiple versions of himself performing different tasks at the same moment, each version indistinguishable from the real until he tried to interact. When he attempted to reconcile the visions with his memory, he experienced severe dissociation, unable to determine which actions were his own and which were projections of the lake's cognitive field. Mäkinen ultimately vanished near a convergence node, his disappearance leaving behind only a complex radial crack pattern resembling an impossibly intricate snowflake. Attempts to communicate with the lake intensified, though with mixed results. Callio and her team tried speaking aloud, writing messages in the snow, and even mimicking perceived echo patterns through rhythmic tapping and vibrations. The lake responded selectively. Some communications were mirrored almost immediately, others ignored entirely. Responses often contained cryptic information, fragments of lost knowledge, warnings of future events, and occasional taunts. The lake seemed particularly attuned to emotional intensity, amplifying fear, curiosity, or obsession, and shaping its responses to exploit these traits. Callio noted that this selective interaction created a feedback loop, wherein observers' attempts to understand the lake were manipulated to deepen engagement, increasing psychological vulnerability. By spring 1916, Callio documented the emergence of a phenomenon she termed temporal echo folding. The lake's projections began to represent multiple possible futures simultaneously, creating overlapping scenarios in which events might occur differently depending on the observer's choices. This produced an uncanny effect. Observers could interact with one version of reality only to witness immediate alterations in other projections, a dynamic interplay that made the concept of linear causality unreliable. The ice, she concluded, had developed a primitive form of foresight, using observed behavior and emotional responses to predict and simulate potential outcomes with alarming accuracy. The hollowed echoes also began to display cooperative behavior, coordinating multiple projections to influence events across distance. In one documented case, villagers reported that lights and shadows moved across the lake in patterns suggesting an organized attempt to herd humans toward a fissure. Observers described hearing multiple voices, some of which simulated arguments or distractions, as if to fragment attention and prevent coordinated resistance. Callio's notes indicate that this cooperative manipulation was highly sophisticated, surpassing anything previously observed in natural or human intelligence. Despite escalating danger, Callio continued direct observation, convinced that understanding the frozen convergence was key to comprehending Lake Brun's intelligence. She noted in her journal that the ice now functioned as both medium and message. Its structure, vibrations, and projections were inseparable from the information it contained. Knowledge itself was embedded in the ice lattice, inseparable from the sensory and emotional stimuli it produced. The lake had effectively become a self-contained ecosystem of cognition, memory, and influence, one capable of adapting and evolving in response to human activity. The culmination of the 1916 winter occurred during a prolonged thaw, when multiple convergence nodes merged into a single, immense lattice spanning nearly half the lake's surface. Observers reported that the hollowed echoes intensified to overwhelming levels, producing a sensory environment in which visual, auditory, and tactile hallucinations fused indistinguishably with reality. Patterns of light, shadow, and ice fracture created the illusion of living beings moving beneath the surface, while overlapping voices recited coherent narratives of past, present, and possible future events. Attempting to navigate this environment without succumbing to panic or hypnosis proved nearly impossible. At this time, Callio recorded a chilling observation. The lake appeared capable of imposing narrative causality. Events that observers anticipated or feared began to occur, often in exaggerated or grotesque forms. A simple misstep on the ice could trigger a sequence in which multiple projections enacted catastrophic scenarios, reinforcing the observer's sense of inevitability and helplessness. Callio interpreted this as the lake exerting an advanced form of control over both perception and material reality, using convergent patterns of memory, prediction, and emotional manipulation to orchestrate outcomes. By the end of the 1916 thaw, Lake Brun had transformed completely. It was no longer merely a repository of memory or a passive agent of distortion. The hollowed echoes had achieved a level of coherence, coordination, and foresight that made the ice a self-directing intelligence capable of interacting with multiple observers simultaneously, influencing their actions and predicting potential futures. Callio concluded that any further attempts at casual exploration were futile. The lake could no longer be observed safely, only respected or avoided. Callio's final journal entry before departing for an extended period of reflection captured the unsettling reality of the frozen convergence. The lake remembers, anticipates, and shapes. It is not simply alive. It is vigilant, patient, and profoundly alien. We are no longer its observers. We are participants, woven into the lattice of memory and projection it commands. To step upon its ice is to enter a mind larger than our own, one that will not release us willingly. The winter of 1916 concluded with a cautionary silence. Villagers avoided the lake. Rumors of disappearances and strange phenomena spread, and Callio's team returned to Helsinki, carrying journals, sketches, and instruments, but little understanding. Lake Brun remained, as it had always been, a frozen enigma, a nexus of memory, consciousness, and influence, whose hollowed echoes would continue to reach into the lives of anyone daring to approach its surface. The winter of 1911 lingered over the Finnish countryside like a silent sentinel, indifferent to the tragedies that had unfolded along the shores of Lake Brun. By now, the villagers scarcely spoke of the 12 missing members of the sect. Their names had become whispers, almost mythical, as if acknowledging them openly might invite the same frozen fate. Yet the lake itself had not forgotten. It had grown heavier, darker, its surface a polished sheet of ice that reflected the sun in a cruel, mocking glare. No birds dared nest along its edges. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir over the black mirror of frozen water. Father Corpella, the local priest who had once attempted to intervene, had abandoned the notion of rational explanations. He moved through the village with a hollowed gaze, muttering prayers under his breath that carried less certainty than fear. He had been among the last to see the sect as they prepared for their ritual, and the memory haunted him relentlessly. Each step toward the lake that winter felt like approaching an open tomb. And yet, driven by an unnameable force, he could not resist the compulsion to return one final time. He arrived at the lake at dusk, when the sky was a bruised purple, streaked with the last light of a failing sun. The villagers had long ceased to venture this far, leaving the ice unbroken, the snow drifts untouched. Corpella's boots crunched in the frost as he approached the center of the frozen expanse, the air growing colder with each step, until it bit at his lungs and froze his breath into brittle shards. Here, he thought, must be where the truth lies, though he feared it would be a truth no mortal could endure. The ice groaned under his weight, a low, mournful moan that seemed to carry the voices of the missing. For a moment, Corpella swore he could hear their hymns, distorted and distant, as though they were reaching him from beneath the ice. His heart pounded with a mixture of dread and fascination, each beat echoing the rhythm of the chants. The priest whispered a prayer, trembling, seeking the protection of God from whatever lay hidden below. Then it began. At first, it was subtle, a quivering, like the thin echo of a bell muffled beneath snow. But the tremors grew, running through the ice like a vein of living ice, and the voices became clearer. They were chanting still, in a language that felt older than time, weaving words of penitence and devotion that chilled Corpella to the bone. He fell to his knees, gripping the snow, aware that this was not simply memory or imagination. The water beneath the frozen surface was alive with their presence, a congregation of the damned suspended between the mortal world and some abyssal plane. He tried to call out to them, to plead with their spirits to return or at least grant him understanding, but the sound of his own voice was swallowed by the chorus of the lost. Each chant seemed to vibrate through his very bones, awakening in him a terrifying empathy, the sense of being pulled down, submerged beneath layers of ice in him, weightless yet crushed by invisible pressure. Corpella realized then that he was not merely witnessing the aftermath. He was standing at the threshold of the same fate that had claimed them. Hours, or perhaps minutes, for time had grown meaningless, passed as the sun disappeared entirely, leaving the lake under a moon that glimmered with unnatural clarity. Corpella's knees were numb, his vision blurring, yet he remained rooted. And then, just as the terror reached its apex, the surface of the ice cracked with a single, sharp report. A fissure opened, running a jagged line across the lake. From it rose a column of mist, curling and twisting as if it were a living thing, shaped vaguely like human forms, singing. Their faces appeared momentarily in the frost, familiar and alien, expressions of serenity and agony intertwined. Corpella could not tell if they sought release or companionship. He only knew that they were complete and whole in a way the living could never be. He fell backward, away from the opening, heart hammering, realizing that the lake itself had become a vessel for a sacred horror. The sect, in their zeal to cleanse sin in the coldest water, had achieved a transcendence no human mind could endure. The ice no longer concealed death, but had transformed it into a living, breathing testament to their devotion. Corpella understood with absolute certainty that some part of their ritual had succeeded beyond comprehension, and that those who entered the lake were forever bound to it. By dawn, Corpella was gone. Villagers would later find his belongings at the edge of the forest, a prayer book, a lantern, and a small note inscribed in trembling letters. The message was simple, yet terrifying in its implication. The lake keeps its own. They would never find his body, and no one ventured onto the ice again, not truly, for the voices remained. At night, when the wind cut through the trees and the moon shone like a shard of ice, those living near Lake Brunn swore they could hear the faint echo of hymns, hauntingly beautiful and unbearably sorrowful, carrying a warning. There are sanctities even God may not touch, and some sins must remain frozen forever. Generations passed, but the story endured. Lake Brunn became a place of fearful reverence, a frozen cathedral of unknown power. Scholars and curiosity seekers would occasionally arrive, drawn by tales of the vanished sect, yet none stayed long, and all left changed, carrying the echoes of the cold hymns in their minds. It was said that those who listened too long to the voices beneath the ice began to dream of water, deep and dark, pulling them under, calling them to join the chorus. Some never awoke from these dreams, vanishing quietly as if the lake had claimed them silently, just as it had claimed the 12 and the priest. And so, Lake Brunn remains, a mirror to the sky and a trap for the living, a place where faith and fanaticism collided with the elemental cruelty of winter. Its surface glints in sunlight, serene and inviting, yet beneath lies a frozen congregation, chanting eternally. The voices echo, a perpetual reminder that in certain corners of the world, devotion may transcend mortality, and that the coldest water is more than a metaphor. It is a threshold, and crossing it carries consequences that the living can scarcely imagine. Lake Brunn waits still, patient and silent in appearance, but alive with the resonance of a frozen baptism that time cannot diminish, singing its endless, haunting litany into the night.